Long before the complex strategies of today, Yu-Gi-Oh! Was a different game on the school playground. Still, many cards were great both there and competitively. So let's take a look at the cards that defined an era for casual and serious duelists. And at number 10, we have Megamorph. This is an equip spell that makes it so that while your life points are lower than your opponent's, the equipped monster's attack doubles. But if it's higher, it's halved instead. Megamorph was the best equipped spell you could get your hands on without much trouble, letting you turn any random monster you had into a beater scarier than a Blue Eyes White Dragon. It probably would have been outclassed by United We Stand on the playground, but that was slightly harder to get, and didn't get a really accessible print until a bit later. Either way, when Beatdown was the main deck type around, Megamorph was a great addition to any deck. You just had to be a bit careful with it, as if you got ahead in life points, it would nerf your monster into uselessness instead. In Constructed Yu-Gi-Oh!, this card was much worse, as equipped spells tend to be. Getting 2 for 1 by removal is never where you want to be, but it did see some play in a few old school OTK strategies, those being Demise and Cyberstein OTK, both monsters with extremely good effects that required a lot of life points to be activated. Stein plus Megamorph represented an OTK by itself, since you could use it to bring out Cyber and Dragon, who would be an 8,000 attack Piercer with it on. Meanwhile, Demise needed a bit more help to kill, usually with Doom Dozer. The ritual was usually brought out using advanced ritual art, which would dump 2 insects to the grave for Dozer's summoning condition. And at that point, you'd have 2,800 times 2 for Megamorph, which is 5,600, plus Demise's 2,400 for exact game. Still, cheesy strats aside, this card wasn't that popular and fell off pretty quickly, which is why it's only at number 10 on this list. And coming in at number 9, we have Gravity Bind. This is a continuous trap that prevents level 4 or higher monsters from attacking while it's face up on the field. Playground Yu-Gi-Oh! Was, of course, mostly about attacking without much thought behind it. So cards that put a wrench in the strategy were extremely annoying to deal with, especially when you were not likely to have much, if any, spell or trap card removal in your deck. Messenger of Peace, which also prevents attacks but from monsters with 1,500 or more attack, could have easily made this list too, but Gravity Bind was slightly easier to acquire since its main set had it in a rare, while Messenger was a super rare. Either of these, as well as other slightly less effective battle stoppers like Ordeal the Traveler and Fairy Box, were more or less guaranteed to be in the deck of that one kid building a stall deck, just to mess with everyone's beatdown plan. What's funny is that Gravity Bind has basically the same function in Constructed, where it saw enough play to the point where both it and Messenger of Peace were limited for quite a long time. It was one of the most frustrating to deal with cards and burn strategies. Of course, playing alongside all the good effect damage options like Secret Barrel and Just Desserts. Gravity Bind itself was especially good because basically all the good beaters were level 4, so it'd be stopping most of the aggression any deck could dish out. However, if you built your deck around it, this could end up meaning very little for your own strategy. That's essentially the premise behind Panda Burn and Goat format, which aims to combo Gyakugai or Panda, a battle piercer that gets stronger the more monsters your opponent has, and also happens to be level 3 with Ojama Trio, to fill your opponent's board with useless tokens that also burn when destroyed. While the card is trash now, and has been for a while, since it's a trap that doesn't impact the board and gets bypassed entirely with monsters with no level, having Gravity Bind flipped up against you was once a telltale sign you were about to have a terrible duel. And at number 8, we've got Creature Swap, a normal spell which has each player choose one of their monsters and then switch control of them permanently. They also cannot change their battle positions for the rest of the turn. This card was a great equalizer when it came to playing casually, essentially letting you switch any of those crappy vanillas you still unfortunately had in your deck for whatever boss monster your opponent managed to put onto the field after who knows how many turns of being in a stalemate. Losing control of a card you put so much work into bringing out felt especially mean-spirited, particularly if you thought about all the weeks of cracking packs or trading up it could have taken for you to get it. There's just something awful about losing to your own card. And you can be sure that if Snatch Deal were an easier to get card back then, Yu-Gi-Oh! Would have been responsible for many more broken friendships than any other TCG. As for competitive Yu-Gi-Oh!, this card still felt like a complete blowout if it resolved in the right deck. It's essentially non-targeting, non-destruction removal, letting you take any mana or boss monsters no matter what protection it had, as long as it was the only thing your opponent had out. It was pretty good in decks that played recruiters too, since you could give the recruiter to your opponent, and then by beating over it, trigger its graveyard effect in your graveyard despite it being on your opponent's side of the field when it was destroyed. Creature Swap was also effective in decks that played spirits, since your opponent would be forced to give you the monster back to your hand at the end of the turn, as well as when paired with Reborn Frog, since it just gave you free fodder to swap away turn after turn. This is a fun little staple that saw a surprising amount of play for what it was. And at number 7, we find Waboku. This normal trap makes it so that for the rest of the turn, you take no battle damage from your monsters, and they can't be destroyed by battle. Waboku was one of the more commonly run traps that you would see back in the day, being available in the Yugi, Joey, and Pegasus starter decks. While just preventing your monsters from being destroyed in battle is usually way worse than using a trap that does that, while also dealing with your opponent's monster, like a Mirror Force would, it's not like you had much choice when playing with just your starter deck. The next best thing available was reinforcements buffing your monster by 500 attack, which is certainly less than ideal. So while it was technically a minus and didn't change the board much, it could give you that extra turn to set up either a tribute summon, or just to help you stay alive. Still, despite its shortcomings, Waboku was a card that saw a ton of play in Yu-Gi-Oh's main format as well. It was a fine option for burn decks since sometimes one extra turn was all you needed. But Threatening Roar, which came out a bit afterwards, was just as good, if not better, in the same situations. However, where Waboku really shone was in Gladiator Beasts, a deck that came out much later but felt like this card was perfectly made for it. The main deck Gladiator Beasts mostly all share the same effect of being able to tag out for another one at the end of the battle phase if they have battled successfully. Then they get extra effects when they manage to successfully tag in, like being able to destroy monsters, spell or traps, or gain reborn effects. Glads were pretty much the first proper archetype in the game, where beforehand decks were basically just good stuff, with maybe an attribute sub-theme thrown in. Waboku was amazing, since it would often let you trigger your Gladiator Beast during your opponent's turn, as you could flip it in response to an attack that would otherwise get rid of your monster and blow them out. Playing around this trap was one of the most annoying things when going up against Gladiator Beasts, almost making it so that you wouldn't want to ever attack if they had any back row. And at number 6, we have Spirit Reaper. This dark zombie with 300 attack and 200 defense can't be destroyed by battle, but if it's targeted by any card effect, it will destroy itself. Also, if it attacks directly and deals damage to your opponent, they discard one random card from their hand. Now, anyone who used to play back in the day knows how much of a pain monsters who couldn't be destroyed by battle were. Spirit Reaper was the first easily accessible one, being printed as a measly rare in Pharaonic Guardian, making it attainable even for those who only get like a pack a month maximum. While it wasn't as iconic as Marshmallow due to fewer anime appearances, it did its job just fine of sitting in defense mode and absorbing hits, and you wouldn't really have a better low rarity option until the release of Arcana Force Zero the Fool. Removal wasn't that easy to come by in the playground, and it would feel especially bad to waste that little that you had to deal with this guy instead of a big boss monster. And while Spirit Reaper does die to being targeted by anything, the majority of the effects that do that are removal anyway. It probably would have been a bit easier to deal with if most kids had then realized that all equip cards target on activation, since equip beats was a really common way to play back then. Still, you can't blame kids for not realizing this was the case when the cards don't explicitly say target in their text, and almost no one was reading the rulebook back then anyway. Even though it was a bit easier to deal with in Constructed, it still saw a ton of play there. It was a card that could help both when you were behind, since it could stall a couple of battle phases, and when your opponent was behind, since you could just poke to disrupt their hand. Reaper's dark typing made it very easy to include in both Chaos and Dark-centered decks, while its typing eventually made it really relevant in zombie decks due to Goblin Zombie and Mezuki. It was limited for several years, and its annoying discard effect of getting rid of the best card in your hand happened far more often than it should have.
Oh no, I seem to be lost in these woods. I hope no one tries to sell me product.
Hello there, are you in the woods looking for card sleeves to keep your cards safe?
Oh thank goodness. Can you tell me how to get back to the main road?
No. However, we do have new card sleeves in the store. These are legally distinct Rose Girl and Spider card sleeves.
I just want to get home.
You're worried about the price, huh? Well, no worries, just buy a mystery box and get a full playset of them along with a playmat, deck box, and a field center.
I was out here to bury a body.
The box also has a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh cards as well. Just click the link in the description to buy yourself the perfect Christmas surprise. And at number 5, we have Prohibition. This continuous spell can be activated by declaring any card name, making it so that cards with that name and their effects cannot be used. However, cards already on the field are unaffected. The useful downfall of this card in competitive play was that you couldn't really know what exactly cards your opponent was playing in their deck, at least during Game 1. But that was a complete non-issue in Playground Yu-Gi-Oh! Your decks probably weren't changing much besides some occasional trades here and there, letting you use Prohibition as the perfect counter to everyone's best card. Of course, there are other cards that would have been better in the slot, but Prohibition was a fairly low rarity in one of the game's first sets, and you know beggars can't be choosers. Either way, this felt like a really good way to stop that one guy who managed to pull a Mirror Force from completely blowing you out, or stopping someone from bringing out their favorite boss monster. In Constructed Yu-Gi-Oh, however, this was at times a really powerful side deck staple. It saw a lot of play during the period where Teledad was dominating the game, since calling the eponymous boss monster was probably one of the few ways of not getting your board destroyed by it. Short of a summon negate anyway. It had various uses throughout the years, usually being better in decks that either relied on a single card or really lost to one single out. For example, Mystic Mine decks, which only really lost to Cosmic Cyclone once a mine and a field barrier were set up, could just declare it. Or Hero Beat decks, which were extremely reliant on Neos Alias being around due to Gemini Spark and Hero Blast. In this case, as a bonus, Prohibition even prevents Neos Alias from being used as a fusion material for both Miracle and Future Fusion, kneecapping the strategy entirely. Either way, this was an extremely hateful sideboard piece whenever it was in the meta, which isn't that different from when you could just put a copy in your deck to stop your buddy's new additions. And coming in at number 4, we have Fissure. This is a normal spell which destroys the face-up monster your opponent controls with the lowest attack. We've talked about how removal wasn't that plentiful when playing casually, but one of the reasons why it wasn't non-existent was due to Fissure for sure. Not only was this card in every single starter deck of the first wave, but it was also a rare in the first set and got plenty of low rarity prints throughout the years. This spot could very well also have just been given to Smashing Ground or Hammer Shot, two similar 1-for-1 removal cards that might have been a bit better or worse depending on the situation. Either way, the point is these cards always felt great to resolve in Recess, especially if they let you get rid of a heavily equipped or 2 tribute monster your opponent has spent a lot of resources on. As for competitive Yu-Gi-Oh, Fissure did see some play in various low to the ground decks, like Gadgets and the aforementioned Gladiator Beasts. Since competitive players, of course, had a bit of extra freedom to choose, it was mostly relegated to being the 4th to 6th copy of Smashing Ground though. Destroying the monster with the highest defense generally means getting rid of the biggest threat on the field after all. Still, there were some situations where Fissure would have actually been better, like making sure you get rid of your opponent's Lumina if you fear your battle phase won't be an option due to them having an Honest in their hand. Seeing as they eventually were both limited and stayed there for roughly the same amount of time, they were just as good as each other in the eyes of Konami too. And at number 3, we have Trap Hole. This is a normal trap that can be activated when your opponent normal or flip summons a monster with 1000 or more attack, targeting and destroying that monster. Since we're on the topic of 1-for-1 removal, what better card to follow up with than Trap Hole? Killing a monster on summon felt as strong as negating its summon entirely in a lot of cases back in the day. Due to the lack of good on summon effects, Trap Hole really was your premier option for stopping monsters before it even got a hit on you. And though it can only hit normal summons, it's not like you were doing many special summons back then in either constructed or casual play. Also, just like Fissure, the card was bundled with the first wave of starter decks, and was the best disruptive trap you had access to by far. This card hitting monsters with 1k or more attack meant very little would actually get around it, and if we're looking at the starter decks only, the few that did were not worth it anyway. In the main format, this card would see play for basically the same reason, though with a few caveats. There were many more badly statted utility monsters like Magician of Faith and Morphing Jar around, but the stuff that could actually put a dent in you all got hit by it. While there were certainly some annoying flip monsters as well as some monarchs around, on-summon effects that plussed you easily and made Trap Hole feel worse certainly weren't around yet. Trap Hole's biggest shortcoming in Constructed was how fast it got power crept by Bottomless Trap Hole, which could hit monsters of any kind of summon and banish them too. Even if Bottomless Trap Hole did only hit monsters with 1500 or more attack, power creep had already been increasing monster stats bit by bit to the point where it hardly felt like an issue. Not only would it be able to hit the chaos monsters that would soon come out, but it also helped keep the graveyard empty so that you wouldn't be able to summon more of them. Still, Trap Hole had its niche, not only as extra copies of Bottomless, but also because it could hit recruiters that dodged Bottomless. Climbing high to number 2, we see Monster Reborn. This is a normal spell that targets a monster in either player's graveyard and special summons it. The first wave of Yu-Gi-Oh! Starter decks in the West omitted a lot of amazing staples so they could be made into chase cards for the main set. Among these, you have cards like Jinzo, Raigeki, and Mirror Force, which were only available in the higher rarities for quite a while. However, one card they did not skimp out on was Monster Reborn. It's not like they could have if they wanted to actually sell their product, as this was arguably the most iconic card of the anime after all. So even if it wouldn't get another accessible print so soon, the first half dozen starter decks all had it bundled in. Either way, Monster Reborn would certainly be one of, if not the highest quality cards any newcomer could get their hands on. It was basically guaranteed to be the only way anyone's deck had of actually performing a special summon, making the card feel even more incredible to resolve. And of course, there was the whole aspect of turning your opponent's luck against them by taking their ace monster, which felt especially good. In competitive play too, this was once an amazing card, and for a really long while, the only reason why it wouldn't see play was because it had been banned. Reborn has the power to swing any game in your favor, and what's even crazier is that its power scaled with new monster releases. Bringing back a decent beater could already tip the scales in the first few formats, but that was nothing compared to resurrecting the chaos bosses that would eventually come out. As you go further ahead to the point where we got better extra deck mechanics, this card was great both as a way to get a really strong boss monster back, or to help set up more of them. It's crazy to think that Reborn sees very little play in nowadays Yu-Gi-Oh!, but it once used to be one of the most impactful cards around. And finally, at number 1, we have Mystical Space Typhoon. This is a quick play spell that targets a spell or trap card in the field and destroys it. This one certainly wasn't as iconic as Monster Reborn, and it wasn't as widely available at first either, only being in the Pegasus starter deck, though they did put it in basically every structure deck that came out afterwards. Still, I feel like MST deserves to be here due to how much stronger it was casually than it was in constructed, even if it was still a powerhouse in both. MST Negates is a meme for a reason. You just wouldn't see actual negates being played on the playground. And of course, most kids got their game knowledge from watching the anime and talking to their friends, though it certainly wasn't everywhere, especially if you played against older kids or frequented an actual card game shop back then. It felt like the belief that destroying a spell in response to its activation with MST would stop the effect was way more common than it had any right to be. When used this way, otherwise innocuous spot removal was pretty much a better solemn that didn't need to be set or required half your life points to be activated. If MST actually worked like that, it would have been a card that was permanently banned and would be unable to come back ever again. Even Solemn has been in and out of the banned and limited list after all. The only thing that kept it in check on the playground was that you probably would use it badly, like using it on your opponent's Waboku to push for more damage. In competitive Yu-Gi-Oh!, this card also saw massive widespread play, as popping a single spell or trap was just that good of an effect. Being able to clear the way of traps for a big push was essential to almost any strategy. MST was the premier removal option for a very long time, even earning itself a spot on the limited list for a few years, where people would have to run worse copies like Dust Tornado to make up for it. It saw tons of play in both main and side decks for many eras of the game, being great against almost every single strategy, bar the rare exceptions that played less back row like Light Sworns or Frogs. It wouldn't be until much later that Konami would finally dare to power creep it with options like Cosmic Cyclone and Twin Twisters. Even now in the modern game, MST has a new reason to be included in decks again with Radiant Typhoon, a whole archetype built around it. Few things are more emblematic of old school Yu-Gi-Oh! Than thinking about how you fumbled the effects of some cards before you properly knew the rules, and few cards were more prevalent in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Than MST. For all of these reasons, the card is the best playground staple that also ended up seeing the most play out of every single card in here.